Hey, Cypher here. This is the 5th episode of a hot potato history series that I've been doing with Tristan from Step Back History. Each week we alternate who's doing an episode on a world revolution. Tristan just did the beginning of communism, which you can click right here for that. But that was the old left, so let's swing on over to the new one. "1968 represents a watershed moment for global politics. Before, when you said left-wing politics, you were referring to anarchism, communism, or something along those lines. Afterward came our more current use of the term. Social issues for persecuted groups and peace became the concerns of this new left, unlike the old left. As a result in this shift, 1968 was a tremendous year. The various incidents of that year took in the issues that had been building since World War II, and ignited a new world revolution. All of it revolved around students, who were the bearers of this new revolutionary change in left-wing politics by mass protests throughout the world. Now I've got to say, this is one of the weirdest ones to draw together. As such, I can only speak in generalities. It was a world revolution in politics without statecraft. No countries were toppled or regimes changed. Instead, a new political identity was forged. That identity was the New Left. It's very clear what that is now, but in 1968, not so much. Multiculturalism, social justice, equality, and peace were the calls of the New Left, but it is hard to discern a difference from old and new prior to 1968. The roots of the New Left were well implemented by '68, but it had not supplanted the old political left as of yet. You see, civil rights movements such as anti-segregation and racial power groups like the Black Panthers and the Chicano movement had all become increasingly successful efforts after World War II. In the long hot summer of 1967, there was a wave of race riots throughout the US that brought new attention to the subject as a revolutionary change in politics. This was not just an American thing. Anti-imperialism and decolonization was happening throughout the world. All these things had their history prior to World War II, but it was afterward that saw a sharp rise in successful movements based on rights. At the same time, there was an increasing intolerance for warfare, especially after Europeans had seen bitter wars of independence like Algeria and Indochina. They had moved to distance themselves from the racialized politics of the past that had led to such wars. The US became increasingly embroiled in one of them, leading to the Vietnam War, which truly sparked the peace movement in the US. With all of this to deal with, hippies arose, making their own counterculture in protest of these things, which would form the underpinnings of the New Left. The communist world had also seen its own separate chronology leading to 1968. Influenced by the West, many younger Soviets chose to emphasize cultural and even political ideas of the West, especially after the 1957 International Youth Festival.
Once again, the communist world holds a festival of youth. They were designed for the export of ideas, so this time the traffic in ideas proves to be a two-way business. Young people of the East are listening as well as talking to their Western friends.
And the crushing of the Hungarian Revolution of 1958, a Soviet counterculture formed as a result of experimentation with foreign ideas. This led to folks like the Styliagi and the nonconformists, who were the Russian equivalent of hippies, of course rebelling in a very different way. Their New Left was a more radical version of left-wing politics because they had to contend directly with Marxism. They campaigned for workers' rights, decentralized authority, and more liberal social policies. So by the time 1968 rolled around, the world was set for a new revolution. Now you've probably noticed that all of these things are kind of something that young folks latched onto. It was the baby boomer generation throughout the world that was forming the New Left. So boomers in '68 were mostly students of some sort, in an age of ever-increasing college enrollment. It was on college campuses that the New Left revolution began. As such, it is sometimes called the Student Revolution. There isn't a discrete beginning to this revolution. Protests were far too numerous to name specifics. It's sort of spontaneously generated throughout the world, so I'll just go by region, beginning with the United States. In the US, there were continuing civil rights protests, with increasing involvement from college students. When Martin Luther King was assassinated in April...
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
These protests went into overdrive. It wasn't only black lives that were the minorities struggling for rights. Many civil rights organizations were created during 1968, including the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or MALDEF, which was the most prominent group of the Chicano movement, and the American Indian Movement, or AIM. The Stonewall riots began in June and kicked off the gay rights movement. The protests of the Miss America pageant by second-wave feminists solidified the movement's goals and connection to racial struggles. There had been increasing protests of the Vietnam War prior to 1968, ever since it officially began in 1964, in fact. But what really pushed students' opinions to the new left point of view was the Tet Offensive in January of '68. Despite it being a clear military victory for the US, public opinion saw the various battles of the offensive as a loss. This is where anti-war protests really picked up. Both of these protest trends blended together when the Democratic Party convention in Chicago nominated a candidate that had not won the primaries. Riots spread in response, showing that the New Left had made its appearance in US politics. The anti-Vietnam protest bled over into other countries, with prominent students in Canada, Britain, and many other countries. Many of these connected the anti-war movement to the civil rights movement. It's difficult to count how much protests increased in 1968, but they definitely did so throughout the world. South of the US border, Mexico had its own civil rights protests against government overreach, culminating in a huge massacre prior to the Olympics in Mexico City. I've already talked about that Olympiad in another video, but let's just say they were kind of crazy. Throughout the Western world, student protests rose to monumental proportions. Each country had its own version, but a common trend was that students would occupy entire universities only to be suppressed. Spain protested its official fascism and remnants of Nazi nostalgia. West Germany similarly protested former Nazis in the government and recognition of East Germany. France wanted educational reform, and Italy struggled for class reform. There was significant violence in Western Europe, but nothing compared to Eastern Europe. In Poland, there were student protests that called for liberal reform in March. The government suppressed these protests violently, resulting in riots. To quell the riots, the communists in charge disseminated information blaming the violence on Jewish leadership. This anti-Jewish discrimination resulted in 13,000 Jews fleeing to Israel over the course of 4 years. Dissidents were driven underground, but this was the first big showing of the Polish dissident movement. Then came Prague Spring. At the beginning of 1968, a reformist was elected to the Czechoslovakian Communist Party. His liberalizing reforms brought the USSR invading to stop them in August. After weeks of bloody fighting in Prague, many Soviet and Eastern Bloc citizens staged sympathetic protests. These protests even bled into capitalist countries. The Soviets were successful in their suppression, but not without fostering resentment. The first organized human rights campaign in the USSR began in the wake of Prague. Many other countries saw the rise of New Left politics in 1968. Several South American countries protested military rulership, especially Brazil. Jamaica had riots after a Black Power historian was banned from re-entering the country. After a massacre in India, widespread reforms of land ownership and anti-caste system laws came in response. Too many other things like this happened to list here, but I think you get the point. A lot of this stuff had already been taking shape, but 1968 brought it all to fruition. This is where the New Left materialized as a political force to be reckoned with. We all feel the pull of the New Left today. Calls for equality, multiculturalism, social justice, and peace are more often than not rooted in the New Left. For instance, this is where revisionism in history is normally placed as beginning. Neoconservatism was formed in reaction to it. The failure of neocons to destroy such progress, along with internet-imposed isolation bubbles, gave rise to the alt-right, the arch-nemesis of the New Left. Our new president in the US is very much the articulation of the hatred that the alt-right brings. He opposes multiculturalism and social justice, let alone the other tenets of the new left. His most vocal opponents are standard bearers of what materialized in 1968. The Western world is obviously still reeling from the events of that year, but the Eastern world had at least one more revolution in store. Next week, Tristan will be covering the fall of communism in 1989. You can click here to see that when it's up. Otherwise, go check out its channel and the rest of this series. But while you're here, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.